Hello, my name is Steve Friedland. I'm a prof at Elon University School of Law in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I'm going to talk today about neuroscience and online learning. I just have one goal. It's to show that this neuroscience, particularly educational neuroscience, a combination of brain science, cognitive science, psychology, and educational theory, can help us teach online and hopefully get beyond the emergency triage approach that we've been taking this spring. So what are some of the problems? As we all know, fatigue can be a huge problem, distraction, a lack of motivation, and the learning from online in particular can be easily discarded and forgotten. So that's what I'm going to focus on in this short video presentation. So let's talk about fatigue first. The neuroscience tells us we really have two minds, conscious and unconscious. And the conscious mind, we wish it was just like a calculator, but it's pretty slow, it's effortful, and it's uncertain. That's why law school classes and law school overall can be so tough. It's that analytical thinking, according to the neuroscience, which is not natural for humans, takes effort, and it's also uncertain. The unconscious mind, which we use a lot because we have lots of instinctive and instinctual behaviors, is used because it's fast, it's effortless, but we base it on patterns and categories. We take shortcuts. So when we see somebody, we're automatically, unconsciously making judgments. Problem is with all these judgments, a lot of times they're wrong. Here's just an example of that. This was used in a study with Ivy League students, and almost 50% got this wrong. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 together. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Quickly, our unconscious reflexive approach says, bat's $1, ball's 10 cents. But that only handles half of the calculus. The other part is it's got to be $1 more than the other compared to each other. Bat costs $1.05, the ball is 5 cents. But that takes effort and thought. So how do we deal with fatigue? According to the neuroscientists, take breaks. It's fine after what they call with Pomodoro, 35 to 45 minutes. That's about enough in focusing on a screen like this. So taking a break is allowing our brain and our body to stretch and recover. And again, there's a lot of interdependence. Physical activity also helps mental activity. Diffuse thinking, where we're not focused, actually can help focused thinking. So if we're trying to solve a problem, we may do our best thinking while taking a walk, going into the shower, when we're not focusing on it. And that's why those two different categories from the cognitive scientists can be helpful as well. A second approach is using unconscious conditioning. We know our unconscious brains are working as we're sitting here. In a study showing happy faces and frowning faces, people actually learned more, retained more when they saw happy faces. So there's your dog, your cat, your nice picture. That actually helps with the learning process. Distraction is another problem. It's related to fatigue, and it's about paying attention. We have lots of things to pay attention to, and that's why these days many of us multitask. But all the experts, all the scientists say that's just doing lots of things poorly at the same time. So we might have seen the tacks on this slide, but unless we're asked what colors are the tacks, which ways were they positioned, they may have already faded from our brains. And in fact, we get unlimited inputs, according to the neuroscience, from around us each minute, millions of inputs. But our brain doesn't have just one memory system. It has at least two significant ones. And the first one's the working memory, which is only a temporary storage place, and it's very limited. So our brains, according to at least some scientists, can handle only 8 or 9 pieces of information at a time. Getting it to long-term memory so it has storage strength and retrieval strength is even more difficult. That takes a lot of attention and a lot of handling with that information. It's called driving home, as compared to getting information. Remember the old days, here is how you get to a place without having a GPS. And it was really harder for our brain to process that than driving home, where some nights I'll get home and I'll say, how did I get here? My muscle memory actually took over. I hope I stopped at the traffic light and stop sign, didn't hit anybody. But the neurons in our brain become so thick and strong, it can take over. And actually, we don't really need to pay focused attention to that kind of driving. So some strategies, I think these are pretty important. Instead of focusing on the class, we can spread it out and look at our learning now as mobile learning. That's what really the neuroscience is saying. If we can only pay attention in short bursts, we need to reframe it. And maybe the classroom is not the centerpiece. Beforehand, we can front load. What does that mean? Give questions about how students should approach the reading before class. Put out a couple of podcasts or short videos before class. And have students ask questions about the reading before class so we get an idea. It's called just-in-time teaching in a way, and they use that in physics. So we get an idea in class what we need to focus on. And thirdly, we can engage them with deliverables. And this is the idea of active learning, where they can be in small groups. We can ask a question and ask them all to write it out. Even though they're on screens, we can pause for a second and let them write, and then post. Maybe if it's a big class, there are too many posts, but we can have some people post and provide different perspectives. We can ask them to find things, like go find an easement, not pick up an actual easement, but take a picture of what might be an easement, or go online and see if you can find something like that, or interview someone. Work in groups. We can take a break and say, we're coming back in 10 minutes, share with one other student, a student buddy, and then we'll come back and talk about it. And jigsaw. Appoint people to be experts in a class and have them be experts maybe throughout the semester. These are strategies to minimize distraction. Of course, motivation is big, and it relates to fatigue and distraction. But what neuroscience has learned that's really important is that emotion and cognition are interrelated. That is, when we're using rational thinking, cognitive thinking, analytical thinking, emotion matters. And so here are strategies for promoting motivation, and it can include, should include, based on the neuroscience, emotion. Moderate emotion, not so much emotion that a person freezes, see a final exam, but well-being. And that's something I think these days that's super important. So I'm going to start putting pictures on my screens like the one here, talking about gratitude in class and trying to create fun, or at least something positive in classes. Second, settled expectations matter even more in a time of uncertainty. What can they hope to see in the later stages of this course? What happens if we have to toggle and switch, where we may need to go from hybrid to, if we are at hybrid, to completely online? So giving them an idea of what they might expect. And third, creating curiosity as compared to judgment. Trying to give them the idea that curiosity opens, according to the neuroscientists, and judgment closes. So it's all about questioning. What's another way to motivate? Stories, narrative. And the studies show that people remember narratives more. So if we can develop certain stories or narratives, that's going to be helpful. So in my hypos, I now use the same person, a guy named Schmerd, and the students pick up on that, and it becomes part of the overall narrative. Experts learn more than novices, according to the educational neuroscientists, and context matters. So if I'm talking in constitutional law about the Japanese American internment camps, instead of just focusing on Korematsu, Hirabayashi cases, I might give them something that gives a little context, like this multiple choice question. And the correct answer is D, but the other answers are just a little bit off. All of them are relevant, and I can talk about them. And in one question, I can give context without me lecturing, with bringing them in and involving them, hopefully motivating them. And that's, again, what the neuroscientists say is one way to motivate. Of course, competition is another. Our brain has a dopamine reward system. Right answers, dopamine's higher. Wrong answers, generally lower. So why not give them multiple choice questions? And here's another question if I'm in constitutional law talking about slavery. How do I present this? Through a question, it's even easier. Best answer is D, although 12.5 million people were forcibly taken from their homes in Africa and brought to the Americas, not to North America alone. So the key word in this question is directly to North America. And I can talk about this, and it gives me a different way to discuss something with the students and not simply lecture. And that's what the neuroscientist says. Use these different ways to motivate and engage. Okay, the last problem. And this is long-term learning is difficult. We saw that before. The brain is unlike a computer. While it's encoding and storing, it's not just that we throw the gigabytes in. There are lots of interferences, and it's not easy. We're going to need repetitive attention to something. Again, I use driving home. If we don't use it in a long term, in a long time, it can melt. Now, emotion helps. We still remember our birthdays, significant events in our lives. That helps memory. But if we don't have emotion associated with some memories, they can disappear. And one other point. When students come into a class, what they learn is built on top of their foundation built from before, the learning that happened earlier. So they're not all the same. And some, if they don't have strong foundations, may not learn as well as others, even though they're receiving the same information. This is a big one, the forgetting curve. Ebbinghaus, 1885, said, when we learn something, it goes right away. In 20 minutes, we lose 40%. I put this on the board now to show students this is key to their long-term learning. In an hour, they lose 50%. So we're going to have to touch things a bunch of times, particularly online, and not just open it up one day and then close the drawer until the final exam. We got to open and close the drawer a bunch of times so we can get students, maybe not to where they're driving home, but at least so that it's not completely gone and just in their notes. So, which are better strategies of those three? And I got to go back. It's the first ones of each. Space repetition, quizzing them regularly, like these multiple choice, and interleave, meaning joining two things together so they can compare and contrast as compared to having one thing in isolation. Think about it, a final exam, an issue spotter has all these things in it, and they have to compare and contrast and separate and see how things relate to each other. So it's the relational and spatial approaches that provide strategies for long-term learning, which is what we want. People make schemas according to the neuroscience. That is, we draw pictures of things. We know how things are put together. There are instruction kits we have in our mind. Here's an instruction kit for evidence, and we can show them these pictures that give them the GPS, the overview of how to get, for example, something in evidence considered by the trier of fact, and all the interferences we're going to talk about along the way. Same goes for the big house of due process, where there's lots of doctrines within due process, from void for vagueness, incorporation doctrine, procedural due process, substantive due process. And while they might all have their own rooms, they're part of the same house. Memory experts use the memory palace, as they call it, from 1,000 years ago, and use these different rooms in their minds to remember things. So that's where this picks up from. What's another way to create space repetition? Actually, during a class, the beginning, we can talk about where we've come from. In the middle, we can have note breaks that allows students to reflect. And then at the end, we survey them. What are the most important points? What's fuzzy and why? And while we don't have to do this every class, it's something that we can use to create long-term learning, beginning, middle, and end, and break it up. So, doing what I just suggested, here's what we've done. Talked about how to limit fatigue and distraction, how to motivate, and how to promote long-term learning. It's not coming from me. I'm an old dog learning new tricks. This is from the neuroscientists, and I've actually been working with a neuroscientist at my university and learning tons of things and trying to apply them in my classes. Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson said it best, I think. You do what you can, and each day is a new day, even though it feels like Groundhog's Day. Or P. Diddy, can nobody get me down? And that may be the way we should approach it. Thanks, and have a great day.